What will come of the only swordsman in this world of magic?
飛んで行こう遠い空へ
At Rigarden Magic Academy, the students were attentively listening to the lecture. The teacher was explaining the reaction of sulfur and how it turns into fire, while Serholt, the main character, was diligently taking notes. Suddenly, the teacher called his name to come up to the board. Startled, Will hadn't caught the full instruction. The teacher repeated, urging him to quickly get up and perform the magic experiment. Will sighed, "Here we go again." Standing at the podium, Will stared blankly at the pile of sulfur. The teacher, Edward Surfins, reassured him that this was just a practice exercise and that he could create fire from this catalyst. Will frowned, raised his hands, and began chanting, "Oh fire, ignite." In the end, not even a wisp of smoke appeared. One of the students below snickered, and soon the whole class erupted in laughter. Only Colette looked concerned, feeling sorry for Will, who had to endure this embarrassment. The teacher, seemingly expecting this outcome, began to mock the talentless student beside him, saying, "Who would have thought that a student from our academy couldn't even perform the most basic of spells?" Will knew the teacher only wanted to expose him, a top student in theory, but utterly inept at performing magic. Another student below smirked, raised his wand, and conjured a large flame that shot straight toward Will. Teacher Edward shook his head. This student dared to act without permission. That was Theon. He excused himself, saying he only wanted to help Will a little. Yet, the teacher praised him, as the flame was indeed of high quality. The teacher then began to speak loudly, boldly declaring that this world is one of magic, where magic rules everywhere, and wizards are the heroes. In this academy, magical talent is the most valuable asset. He glanced at Will and stated that those who lack magical talent and cling to unrealistic dreams should leave this academy as soon as possible. Will stood dazed in the hallway after class when suddenly a mocking voice echoed, asking if he had made a fool of himself again. It was Theon and his two cronies. Theon sneered at Will for frequently going to the dungeon to farm monsters. This monster farming could earn extra points, which helped students pass their courses and avoid expulsion. But in Theon's eyes, this was only fitting for weak magicians like Will. At that moment, Colette appeared and shouted, "Hey, you guys, stop it right now." Theon greeted Colette cheerfully as she angrily approached. He couldn't understand why a talented and beautiful magician like Colette would always defend this loser. Colette scolded Theon directly, saying, "You're not allowed to bully my best friend, and Will is kinder and works harder than anyone else." Theon was taken aback, and Will was equally surprised. Then Theon decided to humiliate Will once more, stating that kindness and hard work could never make someone a great magician. In other words, Will's dream of becoming a Magia Wendy was nothing but a fantasy. These words cut through Will like a knife. The group shamelessly walked away, with Theon not forgetting to add that Will should leave this place soon, just as Teacher Edward had suggested. Colette, worried that Will might be upset, told him not to pay attention to what they said, and even mentioned that she would ask Teacher Edward why he always made Will the butt of the joke. But Will replied that it was undeniable that he couldn't use magic, though having a sweet girl like Colette worry about him was indeed a blessing. This made Colette blush, and she asked Will why he would say something like that. Will responded that she was his only friend and that, truthfully, Colette was really adorable. This comment caused Colette to feel dizzy, nearly drooling on the spot, and she had to scold Will, pushing him away, telling him not to tease her like that. Colette felt like her heart was about to jump out of her chest. Come on, she needed to regain her confidence and act like the noble lady she was. Will suddenly fell silent, clutching a pair of glasses in his hand. He remarked that today's sky was as beautiful as ever. Colette also felt the warmth of the sunlight, which was thanks to the Magia Wendy. Long ago, when humans were still shrouded in darkness and unaware of the sky above, the world was threatened by invaders from the upper heavens. 5 magicians rose to fight off these invaders and brought peace to the world. They were called the Magia Wendy, a title bestowed upon the strongest, passed down through the generations to this very day. It's a dream, an honor that every magician wishes to attain at least once in their lifetime. Colette squinted up at the highest peak and softly wondered if the Snow Princess was watching them from a window. Will was momentarily dazed, then smiled at his friend's words. Maybe so, he mused. In that distant place at the very top by a window, she might be looking this way too. Will gently extended his hand, recalling his childhood. He had a childhood friend named Elfaria. She had once told him that beyond their sky, there were the sun and the moon. The two of them would talk endlessly, and Elfaria had also said, "That's not all. On the other side of the sky, there's something incredibly beautiful called a sunset. Everything is bathed in a deep crimson, the most beautiful moment in the world." And so, the two kids promised each other they would become Magia Windy, reach the closest place to the sky, and watch the sunset together. But she was completely serious about it. With her natural talent, she became the youngest person to achieve the title of Magia Windy. After that, she ascended to the upper tower. Meanwhile, Will was just an inept nobody, ranked even below ordinary people. Yet, not for a moment had he forgotten that childhood promise. Though he was pathetic in the present, Will still believed that one day, he would be able to stand beside Elfaria. Scene change. Will is being scolded. Another teacher is berating him, causing Will to collapse to the ground in fear. This bespectacled teacher's name is Werkner, and he's furious because Will had once again ventured into the 7th level of the dungeon to farm monsters, a reckless act that was tantamount to playing with his own life. Will knew that the teacher was genuinely worried about him, so he knelt and bowed his head, apologizing profusely. But he didn't forget to ask about his credit points this time. Werkner glared at him sternly, but eventually confirmed that Will had successfully defeated the evil guard boss, awarding him 2 credit points. Will's face lit up with joy. Werkner signed the credit authorization form, but then hesitantly asked Will, "You still haven't given up on your dream of becoming a Magia Windy, have you?" Will didn't understand. Was that a bad thing? With no other choice, Werkner had to explain once again that to advance to the upper tower, Will would need to be accepted into the upper institute. This required accumulating credit points across 3 major courses: theory, practice, and combat, totaling 12,000 credit points. Werkner said, "For someone who can't use magic like you, there's no way you can pass the practical course." Will responded that knowing this, he had been trying to earn extra points through combat. Hearing this, Werkner sternly warned him that trying to advance through combat alone was impossible. Will understood that these words weren't meant just to scare him. Werkner was genuinely concerned about a student facing high-level monsters without any ability to use magic. But despite hearing this, Will had no intention of giving up. The teacher, at his wit's end, could only take a deep breath and shout, "You're not even guaranteed to graduate, let alone earn the title of Magia Windy." He then reminded Will that he was short 4 credit points for the week because he had failed the previous practical exam. In a hurry, Will opened his notebook to check what monster he needed to defeat to earn those 4 credit points. Werkner sighed in exasperation. Pretending to talk to himself, he mentioned that there was a monster named Baskerville on the 6th level that no learner had yet defeated. Will's jaw dropped in shock, and then he rushed forward to hug Werkner's leg like a small puppy, repeatedly thanking the kind teacher. They didn't realize that outside the door, Theon had overheard everything. He decided that he would find a way to expel Will from the academy. The night was windy, and this was the gate leading to the dungeon. Will confidently entered with his cat, believing that this time he would successfully defeat Baskerville since he had fought it once before. The cat just sighed and meowed. It turned out that during the last encounter, Will had almost gotten the cat roasted by not paying attention. Once again, he had to rely on Kiki's keen nose to help him locate the enemy. Meanwhile, Theon was persuading his 2 cronies that the academy didn't need useless people, so they would deal with the monster before Will arrived. This way, he wouldn't have the chance to earn the 4 credit points, and expulsion would be the only thing waiting for him. One of Theon's friends, a bit frightened, hesitated, wondering if it was okay since they were the only ones on the 6th level. This comment immediately enraged Theon, who thought his lackey was underestimating him. The 2 cronies, now terrified, had no choice but to obey him. Theon thought to himself, in this world, those who can't use magic have no right to utter the words, Magia Windy. Those eyesores don't deserve to stand in this academy. Our target is Baskerville. But as soon as they encountered the monster, One of the cronies was punched so hard that he was embedded into the wall, taken out faster than a blink of an eye. Only then did Theon realize with horror that this monster was far beyond their capability to defeat. The scream caught Will's attention. He wondered if someone was injured. Will rushed over and saw that Baskerville was about to finish off Theon. No, this wasn't Baskerville. It was an evil sentinel. Will was puzzled. Wasn't this monster supposed to be in a deeper level? Then he noticed Theon sitting helplessly on the ground, desperately casting his spells, but they were completely ineffective. The level difference was too vast. Theon was as good as dead. Will realized that he might need to lend a hand. He considered drawing his sword but hesitated, questioning whether he really needed to help these guys. After all, they had bullied him relentlessly at school, pushing him to the brink of wanting to leave that wretched academy. But then, a vision appeared in his mind. It was Elfaria, the grown-up version. She had once told him that she knew Will was a kind and good-hearted young man. Back then, Elfaria had given Will these glasses. Will knew deep down that he wasn't that kind of person. He just really wanted to be by Elfaria's side. Will made up his mind. He put on the glasses and stomped the ground to gather momentum. Just as the monster swung its sword at Theon, Will appeared in front of it and blocked the strike. The power of that attack was undeniable. It could have easily taken Theon's life 100 times over, but Will seemed to block it without much difficulty. Meanwhile, Teacher Edward went to find Teacher Werkner, informing him that Theon's group had entered the dungeon without permission. Edward was fed up with these noble kids and asked Werkner if he could use magic to locate them. Werkner quickly brought out a birdcage and asked which level they had gone to. Edward replied it was the 6th level. At this, Werkner calmly remarked that there was nothing to worry about since Will was there. The crystal ball lit up, and they began to see the scene where Will was fighting. His speed was incredible, constantly dodging the monster's deadly strikes. The Sentinel and Will were locked in combat while Theon watched in helpless disbelief. He couldn't recognize this as the same Will he had always mocked as useless. Edward, too, was stunned. It was the first time he had seen the student he often criticized fighting like a hero against a formidable enemy. Werkner then explained that Will was an extraordinary child, possessing strength far beyond that of a typical magician, combined with endurance comparable to that of a dwarf. Additionally, he had sharp eyesight, capable of tracking an enemy's movements with just a single glance. It was true, everyone knew that Will couldn't use magic, but he still had incredible combat power. He had just severed the monster's arm, causing its massive blade to fall. Will picked up the enormous sword and delivered a finishing blow with speed faster than lightning, instantly decapitating the monster. Breathing heavily, Will approached Theon to check on him, only to see Theon grinding his teeth in anger and disbelief. On the other side, Edward slammed his desk in fury. How can this be possible? How can someone who can't use magic be superior to those who wield it? Enraged, Edward stormed off, leaving Werkner scratching his head in concern. Later, Will went to Werkner's office, bringing the Sentinel's sword and the monster's head. The teacher grudgingly awarded him 10 credit points, causing Will and his cat to jump for joy. This is the story of a young man who used his sword to transform the world into a place where swords and wands could stand side by side. Today, during Professor Werkner's class, he declared emphatically that climbing the tower to earn points, referring to passing into the Senate and then reaching the top floor of the Wizard's Tower, where those who achieve the title of Magia Windy reside, was the ultimate goal. To reach that place, you must earn the recognition of the Senate as the highest educational institution. There are 2 ways to enter the Senate. The first is to create a new magic spell. The second is to accumulate a certain number of credits at this academy. Only a very few can achieve the first method, while most students have to choose the second method. However, at this point, the professor glared, "You students sitting here, you're not even guaranteed to graduate from the academy, let alone make it into the Senate." This statement really hit the lazy students below hard. The professor then decided to give his students the most thorough remedial instruction possible, and Will was in tears.
So what do you think? Can I have a check, please? 会計お願いします
After the class ended, Colette, along with Will, remarked with a wry smile that Professor Werkner's remedial sessions seemed even more intense this time. Indeed, Will felt as if the professor were training Spartan warriors about to go into battle, constantly making them take practice exams. Colette was also surprised that despite Will having high theoretical scores, the professor was still so strict with him. Oh well, the main reason was that Will had failed all the practical coursework. He knew his magical skills were lacking and needed to work harder. That said, it's rare to see such dedicated remedial instruction. If it were Professor Edward, he would probably never offer extra help. Suddenly, a commotion caught their attention. The crowd was buzzing about how Thean Cheyenne had defeated the evil sentinel. The friends were astonished, knowing that defeating such a monster was equivalent to earning 10 credits. It turned out that Thean's younger brother had been unconscious at the time, and when he came to, he saw his older brother had already dealt with the monster. But deep down, Thean knew he hadn't done it himself. Clearly, the useless brother had killed the monster. Just then, Will and Colette passed by, and Thean immediately felt a surge of anger. He rushed over, grabbed Will by the collar, and shouted, "Don't get too cocky with me." Will was startled and confused, but then Thean let him go and walked away. Will was bewildered, and soon after, Professor Edward went straight to the principal's office and demanded that Will be expelled immediately. The elderly principal calmly held a cup of tea and said, "Oh dear, why have you decided so abruptly, Edward? Will is already in his final year, and expelling him now, I fear." But Edward, like a wild beast, shouted angrily, "He's not a mage but a warrior. Such a person is unnecessary in our academy, principal. How can someone who can't use magic be someone who stands above magic?" The principal used magic to access Will's records. Will Selfault's theoretical achievements were always excellent, and his perspective on magical analysis was notably interesting. The principal, with a gentle demeanor, said, "If we could overlook his inability to use magic, he would still be an exceptionally talented student. It's not an exaggeration to say that he could become a magical engineer or a potion master. His future prospects are very promising." Preparing for that day, producing wise individuals is also one of the Academy's responsibilities. Hearing this, Edward realized that the principal seemed to share some of his views. He responded, "But the person we're talking about isn't wise and is aiming for the title of Magia Windy. That's the real issue, sir." The principal replied, "That's indeed a problem. So, Edward, conduct a test on him. Since you know the truth about Will, you should personally be the judge of the test." Of course, if Will didn't pass, the principal would leave the decision entirely to Edward. Edward, excited and turning pale, asked if the principal was sure about this, as he would not go easy on Will. Principal Corden continued to smile warmly and enjoyed her tea, saying plainly, "I don't mind," and even allowed Edward to decide the content of the test himself. Thus, Edward, nicknamed the Shadow Serpent Mage, the closest to the title of Magia Windy, would directly use his power to drive out this incompetent student. In a library, Will continued to diligently write his thesis. Magical History Year 344, the Garza Long War, sparked by residents from another world, saw the dwarf race heavily oppressed and exploited. Similarly, the elf race was also suffering due to racial discrimination, and in this situation, the two races allied their soldiers and engaged in a rebellion. The dwarf army at one point numbered over 20,000 troops. Seeing this, Colette sweat and thought that Will was working too hard. Despite having high theoretical scores, he was still pushing himself so much. Will needed credits, and even missing 1 point could prevent him from entering the Senate. Moreover, he was very fond of this thesis because the dwarf race was quite similar to him, both being regarded as inept. They had used their physical strength, along with shields and swords, to fight against mages. Will believed that the spirit of not giving up was a strength beyond magic. Colette asked if that was a lesson from Professor Werkner, and indeed, it was also Will's favorite saying. Will stretched to relieve his fatigue, and said he needed to work harder. Unexpectedly, Colette noticed a gray hair and scolded Will, saying that he had pushed himself too hard, leading to the gray hair. Perhaps Will needed to rest his head on Colette's lap so she could pull out the gray hairs for a while. Just then, a stern voice rang out, "What are you two doing?" Professor Edward glared at them, and Colette apologized, saying they were just studying on their own. Without further ado, Edward demanded that we'll come to the practice area to meet him alone. At the isolated practice area, away from the classrooms, Professor Edward began with criticism. I'm here to give you remedial instruction because you failed repeatedly in the practical section. You should be grateful. Will was surprised. Was Professor Edward actually giving him remedial help? And just for him alone? Edward smirked and confirmed. He merely waved his wand, and red and black mana appeared as he declared, "Show me your strength." Immediately, a stream of black mana slid toward Will's feet, startling him. Edward announced the test for today. Hit me with a single blow. You have no right to refuse. If you succeed, I will grant you 5 credits in the practical section. However, if you fail, leave this academy. Edward loftily added, I will never allow inept individuals to aim for the title of Magia Windy. This gave Will a reason to fight. Before he could fully grasp the situation, the space was filled with the professor's mana. Professor Edward unleashed the Dax Dalbekin spell. At the same time, Principal Corden summoned Professor Werkner, apologizing for the urgent call but explaining that she wanted him to witness the battle between Will and Edward. Werkner was stunned and asked what was happening. Principal Corden, still smiling, said, Wagner, it's a taboo for Edward to be interrupted during a test. Wagner was enraged and completely disagreed with Edward's behavior, believing it was utterly unfair. Principal Corden asked, Why do you think so? Werkner shouted, Why? Because Edward is the closest to the title of Magia Windy. Even though he has failed before, he still holds a very high rank, listed among those who meet the standards for climbing the tower. Meanwhile, Edward's magic was as fierce as a storm. Even a low-level spell was enough to blow Will away like a marble. Will used his agility to dart forward, but as soon as he got close to the professor, a terrifying mana barrier blocked his approach. Will delivered a powerful kick, but it was ineffective. He knew the professor's defense was impenetrable. Edward thought that kicking this barrier was hopeless, so he raised his hand and streams of mana began to rush toward Will, who could only raise his hands to block the attack, thinking, even the professor isn't incanting. The time between activation is too fast. Both offense and defense are flawless. I can't even make a scratch on him. Breathing heavily on the ground, Will watched as the professor slowly approached, saying he would deliver a second blow. The magic I'm about to use will burn you in black flames. Oh, curtain, sing a mournful song. Will gritted his teeth as the professor aimed his wand, reciting the incantation clearly. Soon, many black magical circles appeared, rapidly covering the entire practice area. Will was horrified to realize this was the unique magic overlap series. Shooting Dax Dalbekins. Edward growled, Go away, you inept fool, and countless black arrows shot out, raining down on Will's position like a barrage of cannonballs. Will was blasted away, crashing heavily to the ground. His clothes were torn to shreds, and he knew he could not win. The professor was one of the strongest mages of this generation. At the very least, he would need a sword. At this moment, Kiki was also injured, staggering away. Colette returned to the storage area, anxiously wondering if Will was okay. She was concerned about why Professor Edward was so harsh during the remedial session. Colette worried if Will might be hung up and whipped. Suddenly, Kiki staggered over, and Colette noticed that Kiki was covered in wounds. Kiki went straight to Will's locker and scratched at it. Colette wondered if something had happened to Will. Kiki looked at her with a pleading expression, so Colette helped open Will's locker, grabbed his sword, and ran off with it. Will was crumpled on the ground in the practice area. Edward approached him and said, Now let's review a bit about the Garza Longi War, mentioning that the dwarf race was a foolish one that dared to stand up with 10,000 troops. Edward asked if Will knew how many mages were sent to suppress them. Edward yelled, Just one person. Then he stepped on Will's head, continuing to shout. With just one swing of the staff, 10,000 troops were wiped out. That is the rule of this world. The sword can never reach the level of the staff. Never. Throw away that delusional dream. Will couldn't stand these words. He used all his strength to push back and said that even so, he still wanted to reach the title of Magia Windy. Edward, furious, kicked him away and asked what made him so stubborn. Was there some noble reason hidden in his heart? Will immediately gripped his glasses tightly and declared loudly that his reason was, "I want to be with the person I love." Edward was stunned, questioning how this could be. Will stood up with determination and declared once more that he had to keep his promise to Elfie. Hearing this, Edward was enraged and shouted, "Filthy, dirty, scum! A fool who makes romantic love the purpose of magic should be ashamed." Edward could not understand how such youthful love could be so powerful. Will, unfazed and unashamed, declared, "It may seem trivial to adults like you, but no matter how tough the road ahead, I will overcome everything. I must watch the sunset with Elfie." At that moment, Colette's hurried footsteps echoed as she threw Will his sword. Edward was taken aback, and Will grabbed his sword with joy, loudly thanking his friend. Colette hoped that this would make everything okay. Will immediately unsheathed the sword, took out the love lens, and put it on. His eyes were now able to withstand higher speeds. Will took his stance, which only irritated Professor Edward further. Instead of using a staff, this kid chose a sword. Will charged forward, while the professor continued to cast spells. A black spear shot through the air like lightning, but unexpectedly, Will was able to slice through it. Continuing his advance, Edward realized this was a spell-breaking sword. However, Edward was about to unleash a barrage of spells to see if Will could cut through them. Will was in a state of panic, recalling the previous volley of attacks that had terrified him. But there was only one way to reach his goal. He had to pass this test. Will calmed himself down and became more serious than ever. Professor Edward yelled, "It's over, kid." As hundreds of black spears were ready to shoot, Will began to spin around, and Colette on the stands cried out his name in horror. Will's speed increased, surpassing the speed of the black spears, reminiscent of the Garza Longi War. There was an unrecorded chapter in history about the mad General Gareth, who, despite losing all his comrades, managed to land a blow on the mage, and even the mage had to praise the warrior's bravery. Edward's black spears caused a series of large explosions on the practice field. When the silence fell, Edward thought he had dealt with the sword-wielding brat. At that moment, Will's footsteps could be heard from the smoke and dust. Will leaped into the air like a bird, quickly reaching Edward's position, surprising him. Will used the ceiling to propel himself downwards and executed a decisive slash against Edward's shield. A loud explosion rang out as Will pierced through the shield like a bullet. The professor immediately counterattacked, and Will also swung his sword. Edward was almost hit in the head. At that moment, the sword clashed with the staff. Will, gasping for breath, managed to slightly cut Edward's face, drawing blood. Edward grit his teeth and shouted, "Give Will 5 credit points." Edward, feeling thoroughly vexed, left immediately, while Will collapsed, thankfully attended to by Colette. Principal Corden praised, "That was truly amazing." Only Werkner was sweating profusely. It was a crazy battle, with immense courage to charge into the fray, concealing his presence by leaping into the air and targeting the opponent's blind spot. Yes, Principal Corden said that Will had shattered Edward's defense with a single strike, successfully proving that a sword could surpass magic, and that boy truly was a sword. The next day, Will went about his routine as usual. He woke up early and continued his newspaper delivery job. Though he was considered inept, he was determined not to be useless. Believing that Elfie was also striving every day, he resolved to do the same. Donan the dwarf, observing him, had to commend Will for his diligence. The two of them planned to meet at Gina's store, but unexpectedly, Will slipped, and his papers fell to the ground. As he picked them up, he happened to read a news report stating that the Snow Princess had created a new magic spell. Will smiled brightly, feeling as though he had gained new motivation. Additionally, there was a decree sent to the entire academy, signed by the Snow Princess. Will was astonished when he saw the news and hurried back to his dormitory. A shabby building outside the academy. Upon arriving, he shouted, "Rosti, have you finished the magic artifacts yet?" Rosti chuckled and asked why Will was so eager. It turned out that the decree from Elfie required his help, and since Will had no classes that day, it was the perfect opportunity to delve into the dungeon. Will changed clothes, revealing a body covered in scars and well-defined muscles that contrasted sharply with his youthful face. After changing, Will rushed to grab Rosti and exclaimed that the content of the decree was to hunt down the ice demons. They were in need of many catalysts for magic, and students participating in the hunt would receive generous rewards. The location was the 4th floor. Therefore, he needed Rosti's magic artifacts. Will's eyes even sparkled like a kitten's. Rosti, amused by his straightforwardness and humor, pulled out 2 magic grenades from a drawer, upgraded and much stronger than before. Will joyfully waved and thanked Rosti. Rosti called him back, stuffed a pastry into his mouth, and advised, "Safe travels." "Thanks, my friend." The great ancestor, the Queen of Magic, once declared that all origins came from the dungeon. Children of magic, rise with all your knowledge and wisdom. Explore the paths that have yet to be trodden. Unite, all of you. On the 4th floor, Will thought he was the earliest arrival, but he was surprised to find the place already bustling. Over there, a group of students was energetically taking down ice demons. Ah, that's Theon. He was dispatching the ice demons with his usual enthusiasm, cheered on by his 2 underlings. However, his face didn't seem too happy. Comparing these to the one he had faced on the 6th floor, these were nothing. That one was much stronger. Will noticed that Theon exuded a heavy aura of bloodlust. He figured it must be the intense spirit of someone on a mission. Will needed to move quickly, as it wouldn't be long before everyone cleaned out the ice demons. Deciding to venture deeper, Will suddenly spotted a massive monster opening its mouth to attack. In front of it was a girl, fearfully sitting on the ground. Will put on his glasses and swiftly executed 3 precise sword strikes. In the blink of an eye, the 3 monsters were sliced into 2 pieces each. The girl stared blankly, stammering, What was that just now?" Clearly, the guy hadn't used magic. It was a sword, right? Will approached the girl and asked if she was all right. She replied that she was fine and thanked Will for saving her. Will introduced himself and asked her name. The girl's name was Iris. Wow, Iris was quite well endowed. The 2 of them then traveled together, chatting along the way. Iris expressed surprise. "Oh, so you're the person known as Learner that everyone talks about. A person who can't use magic and is unprecedentedly inept in history." Will was at a loss for words. The comment stung. Iris innocently added that she was only 14, so she was in her 4th year, 2 years younger than Will. Will sweat nervously and asked if she had any prejudices against him. After all, he was the inept one everyone scorned. But Iris said she couldn't have any prejudice or insult someone who had saved her. In fact, she respected Will for being so strong despite lacking magic, finding his unique approach to developing his talent commendable. Damn, Will felt a bit uncomfortable with those words, his heart racing. To ease the tension, he asked the girl if she was here to carry out the decree. Indeed, she cheerfully affirmed that she would do anything useful for the Magia Windy, as she saw it as part of her effort to support the sky. Will felt she wasn't boasting. In reality, humanity didn't truly understand the sky. What currently enveloped the world was the Great Barrier, also known as the False Sky, upheld by the immense magical power of the Magia Windy. According to the prophecy, if the barrier were to be destroyed, the world would once again fall into a dark abyss, and calamities would begin. The students supporting the decree weren't necessarily admiring the Magia Windy, but genuinely believed they could help uphold the sky. Suddenly, Iris called Will, saying she had met Elfaria-sama before. Will was surprised. Iris even mentioned that they had talked quite a bit. She looked extremely happy remembering it and vowed that, for Elfaria, she would dedicate all her efforts. At that moment, Will felt something, and Iris mentioned that despite being deep in here, she still hadn't found any ice demons. She thought they might have been wiped out, which was why her search magic wasn't effective. Will sat down, and Iris asked what he was doing. He was examining some ice fragments, which turned out to be traces of ice demon movement. Normally about 0.5 millimeters, these were much larger, indicating a very large one ahead. Hearing "very large" made Iris shiver a bit. but she remained skeptical about Will's guess, as he couldn't use magic. Will simply said that while magic was indeed amazing, he didn't think it was omnipotent. Iris was astonished. Will began preparing his equipment, the bombs Rosti had given him, along with a long iron hook. He put on his glasses and declared that although he was inept, he believed he could compensate for that shortcoming with intelligence, wisdom, and, ultimately, experience. The two of them entered the area where the ice demons were lurking. Iris was still thinking about Will's words regarding experience when she suddenly felt something behind her. Indeed, a gigantic ice demon was emerging from above. Will immediately went into combat mode. With a swift step, he grabbed Iris and pulled her away from the monster's bite. Iris didn't even recognize what kind of creature it was. It was a Frosterex, a mutated ice demon. Will was right. It was enormous, and every step it took caused destruction. While the two of them were hugging each other, the Frosterex began firing ice magic. Will quickly moved Iris to another spot, telling her to wait there. Iris screamed that she couldn't, as physical attacks were completely ineffective against the Frosterex. If it got close and touched her even for a moment, she would be instantly frozen. Hence, it was also known by the nickname Dwarf Slayer. The only way to deal with it was to attack from a distance using magic. Iris was sure that her senpai couldn't defeat it. On the contrary, Will reassured her not to worry and took off, saying, "Because I've defeated it many times before." The monster targeted Will and fired a stream of terrifying magic from its mouth. But Will managed to jump high, and the monster continued to follow him, shifting its aim in midair. The magic blasts tore apart the cave walls wherever they hit, but Will was fast. He landed and continued moving like lightning. The bombs secured to the iron hook. Will threw them forcefully. The monster, caught off guard, could only stare in disbelief. In an instant, the hooked wire wrapped around it. Will then declared that the Frosterex's weaknesses were holy fire and high explosive attacks. That was why he often had to borrow bombs from his roommate. The monster sensed the danger and roared, creating a shockwave of freezing cold that radiated outwards. Will jumped out of the monster's attack range, enduring the bone-chilling wind that swept over him. He ignited the wire, and the fire quickly spread along the parts of its body where the wire had bound it. In that moment, the bombs exploded, creating a massive, terrifying blast. The monster was directly crushed, turning into a chaotic pile of ice. The wire coiled back to Will's waist. As expected from Rosti's work, it was incredibly reliable. Will made a mental note to thank him next time. Iris was in awe, having just witnessed a magnificent battle performed by someone with no magical talent at all. She adjusted her glasses, wondering if this was truly the so-called incompetent person. There was such a huge disparity between the rumors and what she had seen with her own eyes. She started to wonder how to report this to her superiors. Will called out to her, saying they had gathered quite a lot and should head back. Iris put aside her serious expression, smiled, and responded, "Yes, sir." At the wizard's tower, in a desolate corridor, Iris walked with her glasses off, still reflecting on her encounter with Will in the dungeon. Despite lacking magical ability, he had honed an incredibly sharp sense of combat intuition. Iris let down her hair, no longer needing to play the role of the innocent. She recalled Will's words and realized he was indeed someone with high combat experience. She wondered just how refined his battlefield instincts were. At this moment, Iris was certain that Will was not a mage, but a talented warrior. She stopped in front of a door and, before entering, carefully asked, "Excuse me, may I have a moment of your time? Greetings, Magia Windy." There was no response, and Iris wondered if they were busy. A Magia Windy member smiled and said it wasn't that, but he guessed if this was just another mundane status report. He reminded her that if the barrier was breached, the world would face annihilation. Another Magia Windy with a grim expression continued. On the other side of the barrier, the invaders from the upper realm are also watching us. To confront them, both our strength and manpower are insufficient. A Magia Windy with long ears like those of an elf added that perhaps they needed more exceptional individuals to prepare for that day. They were determined not to let the prophecy come true. Then, The grim-faced Magia Wendy began to ask Iris if she had found anyone. Iris replied that she had found an interesting person while observing the academy. This person, who could not use magic and was known as the incompetent one, was named Wistoria. Iris requested to recommend him as a member of the tower. The four Magia Wendy fell silent, each with their own thoughts. The handsome one thought that this was outside the scope of today's meeting, while the elf woman told Iris to leave, indicating her displeasure. The grim-faced one seemed intrigued. The elf woman added that she didn't want to increase the number of lowly individuals around her. Wasn't it already frustrating enough? The unpleasant-faced Magia Wendy immediately shouted, "You are so conservative!" He believed that even if someone were a dwarf, as long as they were useful, it was acceptable. The elf woman was furious and radiated a fierce aura, cursing the fact that a Thunder clan member could sit in such a high position. The handsome one clapped and said, "Let the two of you stop. It doesn't matter how it turns out. It's not necessary to decide right now. The Grand Magic Assembly is coming soon. Based on the results of the assembly, we can make a decision then." The Thunder clan member agreed, saying, "Yes, if he is someone we can use, he will make his way here on his own. If not, then his abilities will be limited to that." He then declared that the meaningless meeting was over and vanished in a flash of lightning. The elf woman did the same. At this point, only Elfaria remained. Iris stood up and said, "The person you told me about is quite interesting, Elfaria-sama." Elfie smiled, in contrast to her earlier indifference, and lifted a piece of ice stone in her hand, which was the stone that Will had retrieved. With a face as beautiful as a full moon, Elfaria said with a smile that she was still waiting for him to arrive. The total credit points required at the Academy to qualify for the Senate is 12,000, which is a mandatory condition for aspiring to become a Magia Wendy. Theon was fighting a golem. Its entire body was engulfed in flames and burned to ashes. Colette summoned floating rocks, which she hurled at the monster using space magic. The golem was defeated, and both Theon and Colette passed their test. Colette's credit points were 7340, while Theon's were 9889. Next was Will, who also wielded a wand. However, the golem knocked Will away with a single punch. The surrounding friends laughed loudly, noting that even a scratch from Will's magic couldn't damage the golem. Will sat helplessly by a column, and his current credit points were 5405. Then it was Liana and Ignore's turn. Liana used lightning magic, and Ignore used storm magic. With a single strike, they completely destroyed the golem. These two were indeed exceptional talents. Liana's credit points were 10100, and Ignore's were 10075. A wand was raised, and an ice shard was created. The student aimed directly at the golem. As soon as the ice shard made contact, the golem was instantly frozen and turned into a block of ice. The student even showed off by creating an ice rose and smelling it romantically. Not only that, but all the golems in the area were affected by this terrifying ice magic. They were all frozen and crashed to the ground. The students were dumbfounded. Julius passed the test with 10,048 credit points. His friends were impressed, noting how top-notch he was, truly deserving of the Senate qualification. With the addition of the Elven Prodigy and Ignore-sama, there were now only 3 people with total credit points exceeding 10,000. Will admired them, knowing that credit points achieved is also a measure of a student's strength. Besides the Senate qualification, he hadn't even earned the 8,000 credit points required to graduate from the academy. This was his final year, and he only had 5,405 credit points. Suddenly, footsteps approached Will. Julius looked down at him and said, "You're in my way, weakling. Don't show up in my sight again." Not wanting to cause trouble, Will quickly apologized. The guys accompanying Julius immediately started flattering him, saying, "As always, you passed with flying colors today. You're truly the top elite of our class. You'll definitely get recruited at the Grand Magic Assembly." Hearing this, Will remembered that the Grand Magic Assembly was approaching, and his familiar, Kiki, couldn't resist sticking out its tongue at the rude Julius. Back in the dining hall, Colette expressed her belief that Will could also be recruited during the upcoming Magic Assembly. Will was surprised, and Colette, noticing his reaction, added, "The truth is, you can't get into the Senate with just two disciplines, theory and combat. In fact, there have been students recruited at the assembly who climbed the tower, even though their credit points were still below 7,200. Will broke out in a nervous sweat, acknowledging that she was right. However, he also noted that during the magic assembly, everyone was raising their intensity to achieve an upset victory, and he felt that Colette might be expecting too much from him. The Grand Magic Assembly is held once every 2 years, featuring a variety of competitions. It's a traditional festival of the Regarden Magic Academy, where senior mages from the Wizard's Tower come to recruit talent. Colette reminded Will to remember that the Magic Assembly is essentially a battlefield where students compete to join the factions of the tower. Whether or not one gets into the Senate is largely decided here. Currently, there are 4 main factions in the tower: Torzus Fudge of the Thunderlord, Instia Balam of the Flame Emperor, Alvis Vina of the Snow Princess, and Elif Kanan of the Sacred Elf. Colette's eyes sparkled as she talked about this. Besides the Light King, these 4 factions are recruiting members. If you can secure a place, becoming a member of the tower is almost guaranteed. Will, lacking confidence, remarked that almost no faction would recruit someone without considering their graduation progress. That's why he felt his only option was to demonstrate his clumsy magic in front of the senior mages. Colette disagreed, saying that wasn't all there was to it. There were rumors that overseers from the tower would be present, and they might even forcibly bring exceptional students to the tower. Just then, Iris also appeared in the dining hall. Will, still doubtful, asked, "The overseer, isn't that one of the Academy's 7 mysteries? Someone as inept as me isn't allowed to appear in the traditional magic assembly. This year, I'll just be helping with the behind-the-scenes preparations." Meanwhile, Kiki paid no attention and was busy playing with a ball on the table. Colette looked at Will with sympathy and said, "Why don't you try participating? I'm sure people will start to see you differently." Will gave a wry smile, saying that if he showed up, the Magic Assembly would turn into a general athletic competition. It turns out he had participated in his second year, but the result was terrible. He was booed and told to get lost, and even thinking about it now still frightened him. That event was indeed one of the worst in the history of the assembly, something Colette couldn't forget either. For Will, it was a nightmare that left him depressed for a while. Will then reminded Colette that it was almost time for class. Suddenly, Colette, gathering all her courage, asked if Will could practice combat with her after school, blushing as she spoke. Will smiled and patted her head, apologizing because he had to work at Gina's store again tonight. That made her sulk immediately. In Slumland Street, far from Urubu Regarden, the capital of magic, the day was like any other. The miners celebrated together after a hard day's work. The streets echoed with the laughter of the dwarf inhabitants. The owner urged Will to bring the food quickly, and as usual, the busy restaurant kept him working at full capacity. The dwarf men chuckled as they saw Will struggling to maintain his balance with the trays. Donan, a regular customer, sighed and said, "You've got it tough, huh? Delivering newspapers in the morning, studying at noon, and then waiting tables at Gina's in the evening." Will just smiled faintly and said, "I don't have a scholarship. If I don't work, I won't be able to pay for tuition." Suddenly, Donan remembered something and suggested that Will participate in the Magic Assembly. He pointed out that if Will won, he could earn a lot of money. But remembering the harsh scolding he received before, Will adamantly refused, shaking his head repeatedly. Madame Gina noticed Will getting too caught up in conversation and shouted at him, ordering him to get back to work immediately. "Look at Rosti over there," she said. "Now that's what a professional employee looks like." Will saw how hard Rosti was working and quickly apologized. But Rosti wasn't bothered, saying that, after all, his roommate was currently in a tough spot. The owner, in a cheerful tone, suggested that Will try to find another person to help out since they were so busy and short-staffed. Donan chimed in, praising Will by saying he worked as hard as 2 people. Will started sweating and asked everyone to cut him some slack. By now, the streets outside had grown quiet, and inside the restaurant, Will and Rosti were washing dishes. Rosti asked Will if he was doing okay, noting that the pay at this place wasn't great. Rosti knew that Professor Werkner could introduce Will to a better job, but Will refused, saying he had already troubled Professor Werkner enough. Moreover, Will truly cherished the dwarf people here. They were hardy, loved to party, were skilled craftsmen, and, most importantly, welcomed someone like Will warmly. Now Rosti understood. Suddenly, 3 students entered the restaurant. As soon as Julius walked in, he sneered and asked, "What kind of low-class establishment is this?" One of his lackeys quickly apologized, explaining that all the other restaurants were closed. Donan and Gina were already annoyed upon hearing this. Rosti recognized that these were students from their academy, and Julius recognized Will, calling out to him, "Hey, weakling, don't tell me you're working here?" Then he laughed loudly. "Ha ha ha, this is priceless. An inept fool working with a bunch of savage barbarians. How fitting." An older dwarf man looked like he was ready to jump out of his seat, but Donan held him back. However, Julius didn't stop. He glared directly into the furious eyes of the old dwarf and asked, "What's with that look, you dwarf?" Then the arrogant fool yelled, "You lowlifes, refugees from another world. You should be grateful we allow you to live in our human country." Will knew that the dwarves had fled to their world after their own was destroyed by invaders from the upper skies. As Julius sat down on a nearby chair, he kicked his legs up on the table and loudly demanded that his food be served. Will understood that they were trying their best to restrain themselves because if they acted against a mage, their standing in society would be threatened, and their race would be further despised. This world operated on the principle that magic was everything, and the discrimination against the dwarves was a microcosm of that. A plate of tofu was brought to Julius's table, and as soon as it arrived, the whole group burst into laughter. They mocked the dish, saying it was bizarre, just like those barbaric people. They even claimed that the food smelled worse than body odor. The rowdy students continued laughing and insulting the dwarves right in their own restaurant. Mrs. Gina and Mr. Donan were on the verge of losing their composure. Will quietly removed his apron and moved lightning fast to their table, startling Julius. Will suggested that they take back their derogatory remarks immediately. Julius suspiciously asked, "What did you just say?" Will declared that this dish was the result of the hard labor of the dwarves, and that it was absolutely not something anyone had the right to mock or belittle. Julius retorted, saying that these useless people couldn't use magic and only licked each other's wounds. "If I say it stinks, it stinks. If I say it's an eyesore, it's an eyesore. So what? What's wrong with that?" Then he kicked the plate of food straight at Will. Will's body tensed up as Julius's cronies began to pile on, telling Will to get lost. But before they finished speaking, Will grabbed 2 of them and slammed their heads into the ground in a flash, leaving them unconscious. Now, only Julius was left, sitting there, his eyes wide with terror. Will declared that their behavior was more despicable and vile than that of animals, let alone being compared to the dwarf race. Julius remained motionless, but then suddenly burst into laughter. It had been a long time since someone had dared to insult him like that. The water in the shop began to freeze rapidly, and Julius drew his wand. As he advanced, the ground froze beneath his feet, and he declared, "Do you even know who you've just picked a fight with?" He then called Will a powerless fool and immediately cast an ice spell. The ice transformed into sharp spikes, hurtling toward Will with such speed that it gave him pause. The spikes nearly pierced his eyes, but Will managed to counter with a swift kick. Julius took the opportunity to launch another attack, causing ice spikes to erupt all around, pinning Will against a wall in an instant. He was completely immobilized. Julius looked smugly at Will's anguished face, pointing his wand at Will's chest. Freezing him in the chest would stop Will's heart instantly. Mr. Donan could no longer bear it and shouted, "Hey, that's enough." Julius paused, realizing there was no point in killing this powerless fool. But the defiant, unyielding look in Will's eyes only infuriated Julius more. He changed his mind and suggested that Will participate in the upcoming magic tournament. Freezing him here would accomplish nothing, but humiliating him in front of the entire academy would be much more satisfying. Will remained silent, but then he shattered the ice that bound his hands, grabbed Julius's wand, and said, "I will participate." Mr. Donan was terrified, while Rosti chuckled to himself. Will recognized that he was extremely angry. Julius, pleased that things were going his way, laughed heartily and declared that if he won, Will would have to leave the academy. Will responded, stating that if he won, Julius would have to publicly apologize to everyone here. Will sat in the changing room, lost in thought, as the opening ceremony played out outside. He recalled his challenge with Julius and felt no regret. With a resolute expression, Will was reminded of the principal's speech. Transcending all limits, using that strength to uphold the sky while avoiding evil, and swearing under the words of the founder, Mercedes, to declare the magic tournament officially open. Cheers and applause erupted from the stands, which were astonishingly large, capable of holding hundreds of thousands of spectators. Immediately, Rihanna was seen soaring through the sky on the back of a dragon for the traditional sky race. The crowd buzzed with excitement, speculating that Rihanna would likely win the competition again. Meanwhile, a student wondered why the princess of the land was not participating in this year's creative magic competition. Meanwhile, the supervisors of the magic tower were also getting busy. The team leader ordered, "Keep your eyes on every single round. Sort them out carefully. We never know where the golden eggs might land." The badges they wore on their shoulders were from the Ember Empire faction. In the highest stands, Principal Corden and Iris watched quietly. The principal squinted and smiled, noting how the new arrivals seamlessly blended into the noisy audience and immediately began their recruitment efforts. The tower was quick on its feet. Iris wasn't surprised, as in addition to the tower, mages from other countries were also crowding into this traditional tournament. The battle for promising students from the academy had begun. Indeed, below, envoys from various nations, tower supervisors, and leaders of major factions were working hard, striving to analyze who the talents they needed were. Iris left, not forgetting to ask the principal for an hour off. The principal courteously responded, "Oh, are you leaving already?" Indeed, Iris felt there was nothing more to do here. She held a small toy sword that made cheerful clinking sounds and added with a bright smile, "Moreover, there's a senpai I want to cheer on." The crowd below the stands was very lively, and Theon was ready. Two juniors were advising him to do his best in the crown contest, promising to cheer him on even though they weren't participating. Theon smiled, thinking how he couldn't possibly refuse a lady's request. It turned out to be Colette. Unable to find anyone else for her team, she had sought Theon. Colette's eyes sparkled, and her face was flushed, which truly moved Theon. He was excited, thinking, "Colette, you finally understand that you should team up with me. Of course, you'd choose me over that weakling." But Theon was puzzled why that weakling was there. Colette was surprised and said, "Didn't I invite you to join my team?" Theon clicked his tongue, not expecting that. It turned out the rule for participating in the crown contest was that the team's total credit points needed to be above 21,000 for Will to participate. So, Colette had no choice but to invite Theon. Will, after putting on his gear, looked up and apologized for dragging Theon into this, making Theon extremely frustrated. He then shouted, "Are you kidding me? Why should I be on the same team as this useless person? What on earth makes you think I'd join this high-level contest? Hey, say something, weakling." But Will remained silent, staring intently at Julius, who responded with a sneer, their eyes meeting and sparking. Theon felt ignored. Colette mentioned there seemed to be something between Will and Julius, which was why Will was determined to participate in the crown contest, the same contest Julius would be in. Theon was furious, feeling that after all the humiliation the weakling had caused him, now he was being ignored. Theon clenched his fists, vowing to take revenge no matter what. Outside the stands, the enthusiastic voice of the MC rang out, "Next, we'll be moving on to today's competition at the Magic Academy Festival. I'm your commentator, Mike Mayes, and the analyst will be the most hated lecturer at the Academy, cunning and dangerous, the dark serpent who has shattered the dreams of countless students with his staff, Professor Edwald Selfence." The MC then started crying out loud, shouting, "Who's in charge of this? Why am I stuck commentating next to the dark serpent? Are you kidding me?" This made Professor Edwald immediately furious, exclaiming, "Mayers, prepare a coffin for me for the next class." Mayers, terrified, screamed, "Professor, I'm sorry. Please don't kill me." Back to the program. Next up is the main event of the day, the crown contest. Please, everyone. The members of the Holy Beast faction will begin using their staffs to create massive magical circles in the sky. These circles shine down and start shaping the ground, creating a truly magnificent scene. The land around the academy glows with magical light, and different geological formations rise up. Some are small volcanoes. Others are wetlands and rivers, deserts, grasslands, and even dense forests. Unlike other competitions, this is a battle of teams of 3. The contestants will start from the edges of the competition area and make their way to the center, where our stadium is located. As you can see, at the center of the stadium, the team that touches the crown will win. Of course, the path to the crown isn't just blocked by the terrain. There are also a series of traps intricately crafted and set up by the proud faculty of our academy all around. You can take the shortest route to the stadium or try to hinder other teams. The most brutal and exciting of the Magic Festival's contests, a true battle royale. Professor Edward also began to explain, operating a team of 3 and dealing with unexpected situations. This competition is much more practical and challenging than the Labyrinth event. It gathers many elite students, so it attracts significant attention from the recruiting factions. Indeed, the excitement of this competition lies in the high-level battles between elite students. Whispering to those in the Academy's illegal betting area, the spotlight is on Ignore Linder, the captain of Team 12, and Julius Rainberg, the captain of Team 9. Meanwhile, Mayers also revealed that he's bet all his assets on Ignore Sama. Mayers shouted again, drawing attention in a certain way. Team 6, with the lowest betting odds, featuring the potential contestant Thean and that incompetent one. Upon hearing this, the crowd immediately began to murmur and laugh, questioning why Will, the incompetent one, was participating in the crown contest. What is he thinking? Stop making our academy look bad. You weakling! The crowd laughed and snickered, while Rost, holding his black cat, showed sympathy for his unfortunate friend. The Flycums, managed by Professor Werkner, started to spread across the battlefield. The professor reminded the participating students to prepare. He was also surprised to see that even Will was participating. He wondered if Will intended to compete. If Will got involved in the Magic Festival, he would be in trouble. Will simply bowed his head and said, "I'm sorry, Professor Werkner. Even if I'm ridiculed and laughed at, just this once, I want to win this battle." Determined, he clenched his fists tightly, then left. Colette gave a slight bow to the professor, who wanted to ask more but decided against it, knowing that once this foolish student had made up his mind, no one could dissuade him. The contestants began moving quickly to their positions, and the MC announced, "The battle begins." Before them appeared many strange square stones. "What is this? Circle stone?" But Julius knew what it was. Suddenly, these square stones began to glow. The MC announced that what was blocking the contestants was a forest of golems. As the squares transformed into hundreds of powerful golems with eyes shining like headlights, a massive wall of golems was slowly advancing towards the contestants. Could they overcome it? What? Oh no. Will from Team 6 has charged forward? Meanwhile, Thean and Colette had stopped. The crowd erupted in laughter, wondering what this incompetent one was up to. Wasn't it true that in the previous practice, he couldn't even scratch a monster? Will shouted Colette's name, asking for her help. Colette, having heard him, took a deep breath and began chanting a spell. Her arms were glowing with small, crackling electrical sparks. "Move, O great earth. Protect us, Steel Hill." She cast the spell Lore Seek Goldolet. Electricity quickly wrapped around Will, who then leaped into the air with a powerful punch. The electricity gathered around his fist, creating a magical punch. At that moment, the Thanos gloves were fully formed. Will struck the first golem, shattering its belly and sending its several-ton body flying into a flycam. The crowd gasped in shock as the screen went blank. The entire stadium fell silent, the MC also stunned. Mayers suddenly shouted in amazement, What the hell? What just happened? Professor Werkner rubbed his forehead, sweating, knowing things would turn out this way. It turned out that Colette and Will had found a loophole. They realized that using a magically created glove for punching didn't break the rules. Theon clicked his tongue in frustration, while Mayers continued to excitedly announce that it was unbelievable. The first to clear the golem forest was the so-called incompetent one. Will's team sailed through as if flying, and Will Selfot was cheered on by the stands. The fact that he was saved by someone as inept as Will became a haunting memory for Theon. He could never forgive himself for receiving help from someone he despised so much. This drove Theon to do everything possible to become stronger. But now, looking back, he couldn't understand how this so-called incompetent person was even stronger than before. Theon felt a deep sense of frustration, holding onto this grudge in his heart, and Will continued to lead, with Colette and Theon following closely behind. At this point, Will's team had entered the desert region. Colette warned him to be cautious of what lay ahead. A rock was being shot from a magic circle. No, it was dozens of rocks. Will threw a powerful punch, slamming it into the ground to create a solid barrier. The rocks hitting this barrier were like mosquitoes hitting a utility pole. However, if too many rocks were fired, his barrier could be destroyed. Will quickly leaped to the side and called out to Colette. Understanding his cue, Colette began casting a spell, Argiolas, summoning a magical sword. Will swung the sword like a flash of lightning, deflecting the incoming rocks. The rocks were even shot back, destroying all the magical squares that had attacked them. This trial was considered cleared. The MC proudly announced, "They have crossed the rocky desert without encountering a single obstacle. So fast. What on earth is happening?" Theon scowled, finding Will increasingly infuriating. The crowd was sweating profusely. A stubborn spectator remarked, "Goodness, that incompetent one. And Colette's magic is impressive too. It must be thanks to him." Ross just smiled, noting that they were only partially right. The supervisors began to take notice of Will. His speed in clearing obstacles was extraordinarily swift, from detecting traps to counterattacking. Professor Edward also commented, "The moves of someone who has spent most of their time in the dungeons, based on experience and understanding, eliminating unnecessary actions and breaking through by reflex. Indeed, that's Will." Meanwhile, Iris was so excited she was almost in tears, continually cheering, "Come on, Will Senpai." As a result, Team 6 led the way. Other teams, hearing this, tried to accelerate, not wanting to lose to the so-called incompetent one. However, they didn't realize that entering the specialty region would trigger traps. One member fell, monsters began appearing everywhere, and man-eating plants immediately grabbed them and lifted them into the air. Malius raised his voice, while the girls were stuck in a swamp, drenched. Other teams are also very anxious, but are being mercilessly attacked by traps. Just like every year, yes, very eye-catching. Currently, the leading position is still held by Will of Team 6. Could it be that the so-called incompetent one will actually be the first to reach the stadium? From a distance, Julius could hear the unusual commotion coming from the stands and suspected something significant must be happening. Meanwhile, Julius had frozen all the monsters blocking their path with a single spell. Impressive indeed. He turned to his companions and asked about the situation. One of them responded, "Based on the range we can scan, the so-called incompetent one's team is in the lead." "This isn't good, Julius. At this rate, that incompetent one might actually win." But Julius sneered and replied, "No problem, I'll take care of them." At this point, Will's team had arrived in the enchanted forest, where numerous guardian magic traps had been set. Will had to stop immediately as a series of traps began to activate. He swung his sword, deciding that the only way to handle this was to cut down all the traps. Will moved like lightning, approaching and slicing through the interconnected magical circuits. The magic hadn't fully formed yet, so these magical whirlpools were neutralized. Mike handed the speaker to Professor Edward and asked, "What do you think of the situation, Professor Edwald? Who set up these devious magical landmines?" Edward clicked his tongue in irritation, and Mike announced that the one who had set the traps was now clicking his tongue. Will and his team quickly passed through the area. According to the rules of the crown battle, the closer they got to the stadium, the higher the chance of encountering enemies. The real battles between teams would start from this forest onwards. Will knew he should ambush Julius's group, as they were leading, and he would have the advantage of terrain. Unexpectedly, at that moment, a magical projectile pierced through Will's chest. Will felt a sharp pain, and Colette was shocked. Fortunately, the shot only hit his cloak. Will told Colette he was fine to ease her worry. However, Will was startled to find that the one blocking their path was none other than Julius. Colette was stunned, exclaiming, "Oh my! Did he reach the forest before us?" Is that true? Will couldn't believe it. Had he and Colette actually lost the speed race to just Julius? Were there two others lying in ambush? Shouldn't they have been the ones to intercept? From Julius's position, numerous ice projectiles were fired at Will's team, and they had to scramble to dodge them. Will gripped his sword tightly and realized he had to change his strategy and fight right there. But something had enveloped the space where Will stood. Theon, with a furious expression, was chanting a spell. "O ashes, now, remnants of the forsaken city of the dead." Both Will and Colette were taken by surprise, not expecting Theon to be fighting. They saw Theon's spell intensifying as he chanted, "Remember, your memories scorched in the flames of agony. Remember, the requiem of the land scorched where you vanished." Colette suddenly shouted at Will to get away quickly. Theon had finished chanting, and the terrifying magic power from his hands began to erupt. A deadly fire shot towards Will, who was horrified by the intensity of the attack. This was known as the Ephraim's Badarian spell. Meanwhile, Julius appeared excited, and a massive explosion shook the entire forest. Mike shouted loudly, asking what that explosion was, while Will was stunned, unable to believe that he was being attacked by his own teammate. The forest in front of them was flattened all the way to the horizon. It was terrifying. Theon approached Will and said, "Get lost, Julius. You're blocking my way." Colette realized that both Theon and Julius were targeting Will. "What on earth are you thinking, Theon?" Theon coolly replied that he had let Colette take advantage of him until now, and he decided it was time to reclaim everything. Theon declared, "That incompetent one, fight me now." Will didn't understand what Theon was saying and yelled, "Right now? Here? Me and Theon? Why?" Theon closed his eyes and suddenly fired a warning shot. He then shouted, "Isn't there a big enough reason to beat the hell out of someone as annoying as you?" Colette was confused and could only scream at Theon to stop. But then, a wall of ice rose up from the ground, separating Colette from the two of them. Colette turned around to see that it was Julius. She couldn't believe he was still alive after the devastating bombardment. Julius pointed his wand at Colette and attacked. Hearing the commotion outside, Will was extremely worried about Colette, but Theon was blocking his way. Will said this wasn't the time to fight, but before he could finish, Theon shot at him again and even threw a sword to Will. Will fell silent, and Theon grimaced, telling him to pick up the sword. It seemed there was no other choice. Will gritted his teeth and picked up his sword.
So what can I have a check, please? What time does the store open?
Theon controlled the flames, chasing after Will using the Lanza spell. Will ducked and accelerated to his maximum speed, while the area behind him exploded. Theon gritted his teeth, realizing that there was no alternative but to fight. Hearing the loud explosions, Colette knew she had to stop them, but Julius was definitely not going to let her do that. He shot ice shards that formed spikes right where she was standing. Moreover, the traps on the battlefield suddenly activated, and Colette realized that Julius was deliberately triggering them. Even Mike was baffled by the situation. Team 6 was cruising smoothly when suddenly a conflict erupted between two of its members. Was there a rift between them? Mike asked Professor Edward for his take on the situation. "Professor Edwald, what do you think about this?" Professor Edward responded that, regardless of the reasons, internal discord within the team was certainly unexpected. Even if the goal is to win the crown, from the perspective of recruitment for the tower, it's a significant drawback that cannot be avoided. Edward said this with a rather amused expression, despite his words being, "How unfortunate." Mike was stunned, but the entire audience was bewildered, questioning if there were multiple Juliuses present on the battlefield at once. Julius was simultaneously present in the swamp area, the volcanic region, the northern forest, and even at Ignore's location. Ignore, upon seeing Julius, had to admit, "Impressive, Julius. I didn't expect you to have this trick up your sleeve." This was a power only possessed by Magia Windy. Seeing that Ignore understood, Julius grinned smugly. In Will's battle, he continued to dodge attacks from Theon, who was casting spell after spell. With his fire magic, Theon's destructive power was undeniable. This time, Theon conjured a fiery eagle. We'll guess that this spell was similar to guardian magic. Theon commanded the eagle, and it flew towards Will, screeching loudly. Will remained calm, thinking that if it was guardian magic, he had a plan. He leaped up and slashed at the bird's wing, severing it as expected. At that moment, Will was about to charge at Theon, but he was taken aback when the bird's wings started to regenerate. Rapid healing? Will sweated nervously, realizing he hadn't destroyed the core of the spell. The fiery eagle also had the ability to breathe fire, and it exhaled towards Will. Fortunately, he leaped to the left and avoided it. Unexpectedly, Theon secretly cast another fire spell. Will, unable to dodge in time, could only raise his hand to block it. He put all his strength into the defense, understanding that Theon was using the bird as a distraction while launching more spells to overload Will's defense. Will struggled to redirect the flames and managed to withstand the attack. The first round of combat ended, and the MC was speechless. The fight was incredibly thrilling. Professor Edward, wide-eyed, marveled at Theon's proficiency, noting that he had truly surpassed a typical student. Indeed, Theon had become stronger, and Will recognize this. If it were his former self, he would not have been able to handle such dense magic. Theon, showing his frustration, yelled that Will wasn't so strong after all, completely unlike when he fought the Sentinel. Will planted his sword in the ground and said, "I don't understand, Theon. Why do we have to fight? I have no reason to fight you." Theon grimaced, tightening his grip on his wand and shouting, "Are you serious? I've humiliated you like this, done so many terrible things to you. After all that, you dare to say you don't hate me?" Will then shouted back, "I hate you a lot. Every time I think about those things, I'm enraged. Do you know how many times I've wanted to get revenge? But no matter what, I must defeat Julius. I can't fight you." These words only infuriated Theon even more. "Julius? Don't joke with me. I can never stand someone as annoying as you. As a weakling who refuses to give up, you really piss me off. And why? Why do you always see everything except me?" Theon was so angry that tears welled up in his eyes. He shouted, "Look at me! Look at me!" Will then realized that Theon saw him as nothing but a boastful, arrogant fool. Theon declared that he didn't care. As long as Will tried to pull any tricks, he would beat Will to a pulp right here and now. Will had no choice left but to give it his all. The only way to salvage the situation was to fight him with all his strength, showing Theon that this sword would be wielded with all its might against his staff. Will raised his sword, and Theon, pleased, thought that Will had finally grown a bit wiser. Theon continued chanting, and the ground shook. With the Guardian, the Eagle, present, Will needed to be extra cautious as he approached Theon. Once Theon completed his chant, he commanded the Eagle to charge. Will took this opportunity to launch a swift counterattack. However, in front of him were dozens of magical circles opening up, known as Dragon Knoll. Will was horrified. A large-scale destructive spell combined with Guardian support, all at once. Yet, Will's steps did not falter. He had long anticipated the trajectory of this spell. As fire rained down from above, Will moved like lightning, zigzagging through the attacks. Now only the Eagle remained. Will leaped high into the air, and Theon noticed that Will had completely ignored defense, even charging straight at the Guardian and slashing at its core. Seizing the moment, Will dashed towards Theon. Theon raised his wand and shouted, "It's not over yet." Both gritted their teeth and charged at each other. The magical circles were just forming. But suddenly, a loud voice rang out, "Stop it! Both of you. A massive wall of earth surged up in an instant, separating the two. Both were stunned. Will bumped his head against the earthen wall, causing a large bruise, and his sword was knocked aside. They both collapsed on the ground, and in panic, realized that Colette, covered in tattered clothes, was glaring at them with immense anger. Will quickly asked where Julius was. Colette said that she had fought him, and then he mysteriously vanished. Theon, puzzled, asked, "Vanished?" But then he noticed Colette's alluring figure and exposed skin, and he immediately fell to the ground, crawling away in fright, asking what she was doing in that state. Colette blushed and yelled, "Aren't you the one who started this fight in the first place, Theon?" The two of them fell silent. Colette then stepped between them and told Will to go quickly, leaving things here to her. Theon, hearing this, was unwilling to accept it. He said that even if it was Colette, it was not acceptable. In the end, Colette lost her temper and turned to yell at Theon, accusing him of being the one who was hindering the entire team. It was a rare opportunity for Will to gain the attention of the tower. Will patted her on the head, thanked her, and then ran off, leaving Theon shouting angrily. Will apologized and promised that he would definitely have a proper fight with Theon next time. Theon, frustrated and tearful, yelled at Will to stop and fight him. At that moment, in the center of the arena, MC Mike announced that the first team to enter the center was Team 9, led by Julius. There was no one here to stop them. They were moving so casually towards the crown of glory. Suddenly, a hurried step halted. The MC questioned, "Who is that?" Rost in the stands, delighted, saw that it was Will. While the others were approaching the crown, Will shouted, "Let's settle this, Julius." Julius grinned with satisfaction, ready to fight. In the wizard tower, in Elfaria's room, she was receiving a visitor, who seemed to be one of her attendants. However, Elfaria was dozing off, and the girl approached and slapped her, saying, "Please stop sleeping." It was Salisa who had slapped her, causing Elfaria to cry out in pain. Salisa reminded her that if it hurt, she should be aware of her position and not just sleep and look out from the top of the tower. It was truly unprofessional for a Magia, Windy to hide under the shadow of a Saintess. After that, Salisa handed Elfaria a stack of documents. These were recommendations for promising candidates from the recruitment department. Elfaria picked them up and began to review them, while her assistant mentioned that they had found a promising candidate for their ice and snow faction, Julius. This person was currently making a stir in the arena below, with a very bright future ahead, and might even become Elfaria's successor. Meanwhile, below in the arena, the crown contest had reached its final stage. Whoever touched the crown would attain glory, and at that moment, Team 9 was facing off against Will from Team 6. Julius held a frost rose in his hand and said, "So you finally showed up, weakling. I was getting bored, thinking it would end quickly. I won't be satisfied unless I humiliate and completely defeat you." Will responded that he didn't need to worry, as he wasn't planning to lose until Julius and the others apologized to Master Donan and the others. Julius aimed his wand at Will, declaring that he would turn him into a test subject. The ice and snow spread at supersonic speed, and in an instant, the entire area was shrouded in a mist of freezing steam. Julius even concealed his magical power to block Will's vision. Suddenly, Will heard footsteps and realized that the three of them were moving, forming a surrounding encirclement. Suddenly, a blow appeared from behind. Will managed to block it with his sword, realizing that in this situation, being caught off guard would mean certain defeat. He decided to charge toward the source of the attack. As the second and third blows continued to come at him, Will avoided them and mapped out their relative positions. He located the first attacker, but was surprised to find Julius grinning maliciously. It was a trap. A large block of ice appeared on Will's left, preparing to hit him. To make matters worse, there was a fourth attack as well. Will had to block with his sword, missing the chance for a counterattack. Julius laughed loudly and taunted, "What are you doing, you useless fool? We haven't even moved a step yet. Damn, these guys are too cunning." The audience was astonished. Were there 4 more Julius clones? No, there were 5. Will thought it might be a magical illusion, but soon realized that wasn't the case. Julius added, I didn't tell you, did I, that I'm about to explode? Indeed, his body started to glow. Will instinctively braced himself with his sword, but the area exploded violently. Rost shouted his name from the stands in horror. The ice explosion had frozen Will, and the MC was astonished. There was no doubt, the magic was indeed a secret technique, one created by the once-in-a-thousand-years genius, Elfaria. It was called El Graflas, and what Julius was using was one of the 12 spells. The first spell, Doppelganger, which created ice statues resembling himself. Will, panicked, asked how Julius could know Elfie's magic. Julius smugly declared that besides talent, what else could it be? He had taught himself and mastered the spell. Though its power wasn't yet on par with Magia Windy, soon enough, Elvis Vina would be nothing. He boldly stated that one day, everything she had would belong to him. As soon as he spoke, the ice imprisoning Will shattered. Will was furious, thinking this was an outright attempt to steal his beloved. Julius's smile faded as he threw a large block of ice. Will sliced it away with his sword, but even Julius's doppelgangers could cast magic. At that moment, both of Julius's subordinates also cast their spells. Will found himself surrounded by 3 doppelgangers, and then, a bizarre object appeared from thin air, crashing down to the ground. Will realized it was a remote circle, a barrier created by the doppelgangers to imprison him. Julius believed that hunting a bloodied beast cornered in its mind was easy. Will, now terrified, saw a massive ice block descending from the sky. This was the Zelnia Kala spell. With Will frozen inside an ice cage, the audience held their breath in fear. Julius declared the battle over, and the colossal ice block came crashing down on Will, showing no mercy. The students in the stands were silent, and MC Mayers also had no words. Even Professor Edward couldn't comment. Then, Mayers suddenly shouted, "So powerful, oh my God." Winning without moving a single step was the ideal scenario for a mage. Julius was declared the winner, and with over 10,000 points, it was clear that these were not just symbolic numbers. Julius stepped forward and boldly proclaimed, "What do you think, esteemed recruiters? That's right. My ice magic, perfected through the secret techniques of Alvis Vina, is flawless. Julius Rainberg will be your next successor to Elfaria Sama." The stands began to murmur, and representatives of various factions eagerly discussed the outcome. Meanwhile, Iris adjusted her glasses, realizing that Julius had deliberately used Will to advertise himself. However, it seemed he had overstepped and now faced a setback. Rost, knowing his friend well, smiled and told Will, "If you didn't win after this, it would be really embarrassing, right, Will?" The large rock behind Julius cracked. He couldn't believe it. His super tough ice prison had really cracked. Will stepped out, his face cold as ice, which was to be expected after being in a freezing cage. The stands fell silent once more. Julius was perplexed about how Will had escaped. Will thanked Julius, saying that the ice had helped cool his head. He admitted that it was his own fault for losing control whenever Elfie was mentioned. Julius contemptuously remarked, "What the hell are you rambling about?" He raised his wand and declared that he would expose Will's miserable state for everyone to see, then began launching blocks of ice. Will moved swiftly, dodging the barrage of ice attacks. Julius delighted in watching his prey run around, but Will quickly closed the gap, saying that his Arzweiss doppelganger spell wasn't perfect. In a flash, Will sliced through Julius's 2 subordinates from behind, their speed too slow to react in time. The figure immediately vanished, leaving Julius astonished. Even Professor Edward, observing from above, had to stand in shock, realizing that Will had hidden within the enemy's attack and then launched a powerful counterstrike from above. The MC exclaimed in surprise over the loudspeaker, "What is this? Competitor Will has taken down 2 members of Team 9, and now Julius's doppelgangers have shattered as well. No one understands why." It turned out that Julius's teammates had been controlling the doppelgangers, and once they lost consciousness, the doppelgangers could no longer be maintained. Will exposed Julius, saying, "You're just someone who can use Elfie's magic, nowhere near her level, not even close to her little finger." Julius, enraged and humiliated, shouted loudly, "You bastard! Meanwhile, in the tower, Elfaria told Salisa that what she wanted was not a successor. Salisa, confused, asked for clarification. Elfaria revealed that what she wanted beside her was a sword. Unlike the autonomous guardians, Julius's doppelgangers required manual control, and will quickly realize that Julius's teammates were the ones controlling them. Will expose that Julius still hadn't mastered the Arzweiss magic. This drove Julius mad. He opened his palm to reveal a transforming ice rose and roared, "You useless fool who can't even use this magic properly, don't act like you know everything." Julius then threw several ice roses and raised his wand. Will sensed danger and found himself in the midst of an explosion, but it seemed this attack wasn't damaging. Instead, numerous doppelgangers appeared, all aiming their wands at Will. Julius declared he would shut Will up and silence his insults, as all the doppelgangers unleashed their ice magic. Large blocks of ice materialized from thin air and hurled towards Will, creating a massive explosion. However, the speed of the attack did not faze Will. Julius felt ashamed, realizing he still couldn't control all 4 doppelgangers simultaneously. But with just 3, he believed that Will, the ineffective one, wouldn't stand a chance at finding his true self. Meanwhile, Will was covered in scratches from numerous impacts. Julius grew increasingly confident in his doppelgangers, believing them to be as identical to himself as 2 peas in a pod, immaculately perfect, beyond reproach. He was convinced that the incompetent Will could never discern the real from the fake. Yet, inexplicably, Will charged forward and struck down with a sword right at Julius's true form. Julius was filled with sheer terror, sweating profusely. Fortunately, despite his stammering, he managed to conjure a wall of ice in time. Would Will be able to break through it? Unbelievably, the blade shattered the ice wall and continued to cleave downward. The force of the strike was so immense that numerous large chunks of ice flew towards Julius. However, due to the close proximity, he had no time to react, and a piece of ice slammed directly into his abdomen, causing Julius to collapse onto the ground. He gritted his teeth and asked Will how he had identified the real form. The answer was simple. Will had noticed that the body temperature of the ice doppelgangers was always around 0 degrees. It was impossible not to detect this difference. Additionally, depending on the magic's operation, the temperature could vary slightly, leading to the doppelgangers leaving behind ice fragments on the ground, much like the Frostwalker ice creatures. Julius's eyes revealed his anxiety as he saw the ice fragments accumulating at the feet of his doppelgangers. Even he hadn't realized this. Damn it, Julius glared at the seemingly powerless figure before him. It was absurd. How could an inept person like Will understand this magic better than him? He roared in frustration. How can a useless person like you know this magic better than I do? Why is this happening? Will then revealed to Julius that he and Elfie had been close friends since childhood, both being orphans who grew up in the same orphanage. Therefore, he was well acquainted with all the magic Elfie created. However, Will could never reach the level of that magical power. He looked up at the tall tower, gripping his hands tightly, feeling as though everyone, including Elfie, was still watching him. Elfie had once told him, "It's okay. All of our memories together and your efforts are not in vain." And those warm words had stayed in Will's heart ever since, even to this day. Therefore, Julius, I understand both the strengths and weaknesses of those spells. Julius roared, telling Will to stop talking nonsense, that this was Elvis Vina, a secret technique of Magia Windy. How can a useless person like you defeat me? Julius continued to use ice magic to attack, but Will effortlessly deflected the ice projectile. Julius, you are indeed very skilled. Until now, no magic practitioner had ever used Elfie's magic, but Arzweiss was a spell Elfie created when she was just 2 years old. Upon hearing this, Julius was stunned, and the audience began to murmur. 2 years old? Will loudly proclaimed that because Elfie had created it when she was only 2, it had many flaws. For someone like Julius, who was so keen on showing off, it was like the story of the Emperor's new clothes. That statement struck deep into Julius's heart. He couldn't accept that the effort he had put into master it was not even on par with a 2-year-old child's creation. He went mad with rage, then started laughing maniacally. Later, he glared at Will and shouted, "Are you kidding me?" Julius began to create a swarm of doppelgangers. How many doppelgangers were there? 8 Julius figures appeared on the stage. Will raised his sword, while Julius, panting heavily, still tried to assert, "Did you think my limit was 4 doppelgangers? You underestimated me, kid." It had nothing to do with control, and Julius declared this as Will's defeat. With 8 doppelgangers unleashing ice magic simultaneously, Julius was confident Will would be crushed. But Will remained as calm as ever, stating, "I'm sorry, Julius, but I've been bullied by 10 Elphys before." Damn, didn't this just touch Julius's pride again? He couldn't take it anymore. All the doppelgangers attacked in unison, but Will quickly moved away from his position, and when he reappeared, one doppelganger was already destroyed. Julius was horrified at the speed, and then another doppelganger fell. He panicked and started to flee, shouting, "Stop it!" However, Will's sword remained cold and merciless, cutting down the remaining doppelgangers one by one. He then hurled his sword, which pierced the chest of one of the doppelgangers, and proceeded to take down the final doppelganger. He even blocked Julius's path, readying a punch and charging straight at him. This time, Julius had no chance to dodge. He was utterly exhausted and could only groan out, wait a moment," but Will showed no mercy. The icy punch landed squarely on Julius's face, immediately distorting it. After landing the punch, Will felt a surge of relief, but his opponent remained suspended in midair, not yet stopping. Julius's teeth and lips were now fused together, and he had lost all consciousness. The MC, astonished, announced over the loudspeaker that Will had defeated the entire Team 9. Iris was overjoyed, and cheers erupted across the stands. The principal was also pleased with Will's performance. It was unbelievable that someone so seemingly inept had defeated a contestant with over 10,000 points. However, the mood suddenly shifted, and people began to show signs of anger as 3 others entered the central area. Liana, one of the top students of the current year, was watching Will intently, whispering his name to herself. Meanwhile, Will was panting heavily when the murmurs in the stands grew louder. Oh, where did Ignore come from? He had already taken the crown and placed it on his head, reminding Will that he still didn't grasp the crucial point of the competition. While Will was still occupied with the battle, they had already claimed the crown. Well, the MC, Mayors, enjoyed this turn of events. After all, his money was on Ignore. The audience displayed a range of emotions, from joy to frustration, and expressed themselves in various ways. Will felt some regret, but shrugged it off. Ignore, on the other hand, was grinning widely, as things always seemed to end with surprises, even in the final moments. Only Julius was sleeping soundly. And the winner of this competition is Ignore from Team 12. From the top of the tower, the sounds of cheers and excitement could still be heard. Salisa knew that the competition had likely ended, and suddenly Elfie asked her if there was any magic that could change the past. Salisa broke into a sweat, saying that such magic did not exist. Elfie then inquired if there was magic that could erase memories. Salisa believed that it might be possible with forbidden spells, but she said she would not let Elfaria use them. The expression on Elfaria Sama's face truly frightened Salisa. She was dizzy, blushing, and crying as she said, "It's not that I'm bullying you, Will. I just want to monopolize you so that I can play with you forever." Salisa was at a loss for words, glaring at Elfaria while trembling, knowing that the students at the school were aware of her dark past. At this moment, Will, exhausted, sat down and saw Colette running towards him. She was bruised all over, but was calling his name loudly. Naturally, Theon was not pleased, but he saw Colette and Wynne sitting together and laughing heartily. They may have lost the competition, but they had won the battle, and that was all that mattered to them.
歩き出そう明日へ水へ
The next day, Donan threw a grand party at Gina's tavern to celebrate Will's victory. At the party, both Werkner, Rost, and Colette were also invited. Everyone raised their enormous beer mugs and congratulated Will, while the tavern ladies continuously praised Colette for her excellent performance, making her blush deeply. Werkner was not spared from the enthusiastic cheers of the dwarves, who thanked him for always supporting Will. Donan was the happiest, continually drinking to the bottom of his mug, and then he cheerfully asked if Will had been recruited by the tower. Colette replied that of course not, still feeling upset that not only did they have internal conflicts, but they also failed the competition, all because Theon had caused trouble. Rost inquired about the other person, and it turned out that Will had invited Theon to join, but he had bluntly refused, saying he had no interest in coming to such a trivial place. It was no big deal. Donan was still very pleased, as this victory also meant they would receive a proper apology. Moreover, Julius was crying out loud in the kitchen, having to wash dishes and shouting, "Why? Why do I have to work as a dishwasher in a dwarf's tavern?" Not only Julius, but also his two underlings were serving and carrying dishes. Thankfully, Gina was short on staff, so having these guys help out was a real relief. The three members of Will's group looked at Julius with satisfaction, while Julius continued to curse furiously, still not having been recruited due to his loss to Will. Suddenly, Werkner appeared worried. Colette thought he was just not used to parties, but what he was concerned about was what would happen after Will and his group celebrated at the festival. Colette mentioned that surely people would view Will differently. Werkner didn't think so. If that were the case, it would be great. However, he knew that unexpected things would surely happen, things that even he could not anticipate. Meanwhile, Will continued to be served beer without getting drunk. Time flew by quickly, and before they knew it, the comprehensive practical exam had arrived. The two friends were worried, as the task for this exam was to explore a dungeon for a week. Damn it, going into a dungeon with regular mages was a nightmare. At this point, they just hoped to be in a group with one of the top 3 of their year. Suddenly, they saw Will walking by with Colette, and the two friends immediately called out to him, saying, "Hey, useless, want to join us for the dungeon?" Will and Colette were surprised, and the two friends felt a bit awkward, having no real connection. One of them blushed and tried to act cool, saying, "We acknowledge your incredible strength, so come with us to the dungeon." Before Will could respond, several girls from behind shouted, "We can't let you guys get ahead." Everyone was saying they were waiting for Will to invite him to join their group. With so many people crowding around, Will started to sweat. At that moment, Ignore, Liana, and Theon walked by and immediately took notice of the scene. Colette realized what was happening. After the tournament, people's perceptions of Will had changed. Could this be what Werkner was worried about? Colette rushed over to intervene and shouted, "Hold on. You've been treating Will like a joke all this time, and you're being too presumptuous." Everyone tensed up and stopped. Colette continued, "Look, Will is very upset." Will's face was dark, but it wasn't from anger. It seemed he was more excited. Will's eyes sparkled like a puppy's as he said, "Wow, Colette, are you saying everyone wants me on their team? Is this friendship?" Oh man, this was the expression of someone who had been starved for friends for 1,000 years. A girl stepped forward and said bluntly, "Colette, don't stop us. Haven't you always monopolized Will?" Colette was taken aback, and the girl continued, taking Will's hand and saying that their credit points would be shared, so he should join them. But Colette wouldn't have it. She yanked Will's hand away and announced, "Will has an appointment with me tomorrow. We're going shopping together." That night, Colette couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in bed as she replayed the afternoon's events. She hadn't expected to lose control like that. Her friend Rose brought 2 cups of hot tea and asked if Colette was going on a date the next day. Colette blushed and tried to deny it, but the whole academy was already buzzing with the news. Rose, knowing it was Colette's first date, wanted to offer some help. She advised Colette to prepare a bit, and Colette agreed. She didn't want to lose control in front of Will again. Rose, amused by her friend's naivety, said that as long as she wore a nice outfit, even a lie would seem true. At the dormitory outside the academy, Rost was reading a book and asked Will if he was going to the dungeon the next day. Will replied that he would be going shopping instead. Will thought Colette's suggestion made sense. She had mentioned needing to get some equipment for the practical exam. Little did he know that Colette was using it as an excuse for a date. Rost had a hunch and asked if the shopping was a 2-person affair with Colette. Sure enough, it was. Rost's mind immediately started racing, as if he had figured something out. The next morning, in the central plaza, Colette was dressed in a pretty dress like a princess, waiting quietly for Will. Her hands were clenched, and her face was flushed. It was clear to her that this was a date. When Will arrived, he greeted Colette with a smile and a good morning. He wore a magnificent gold necklace, and Will patted her head, saying he thought he would be early, but it turned out Colette was even earlier. She blushed and awkwardly explained that she had woken up early by accident. Then, Will's gaze fixed on Colette, prompting her to ask, "What is it?" Will smiled and adjusted his glasses, saying that her hairstyle and outfit suited her very well. This made Will feel a bit shy, and hearing this, Colette nearly swooned. She drooled and turned even redder, her limbs starting to lose control. She covered her mouth and thanked Will. Suddenly, a figure appeared behind them. It was Rost. He greeted Colette and Will with a good morning. The three stood in silence. Colette didn't know Rost, so he quickly introduced himself as Will's roommate and wished them a pleasant day. Colette asked Will what was going on. Will patted his head and explained that since Rost insisted, he agreed. Rost, shamelessly, said that shopping was more fun with a crowd. Rost grabbed Will's hand and pushed him along, saying they needed to hurry because there was a lot to buy. This scene nearly made Colette faint. How could they, two people of the same gender, be holding hands like that? To her shock, Rost turned around and committed an unforgivable act that left Colette in despair on the spot. She yelled, "What's going on? What is this all about?" They then went to the library, where Will and Rost were engrossed in choosing books together. Colette was almost unceremoniously pushed aside. Rost took the initiative to pick out clothes for Will, doing it quickly and professionally, while Colette struggled and failed. The two guys even shared an ice cream, leaving Colette feeling defeated. Will noticed that Colette seemed to have lost her fighting spirit and was sitting there dejectedly, so he asked her what was wrong. Colette turned with a pout and asked loudly, "What is going on with that guy?" Colette, bewildered and dazed, said to Will, "He's always around you. From the start, I noticed something odd about the distance between you two. Is he really just a roommate? His face is also quite cute. Could he actually be a girl instead?" This left Will extremely surprised, and he replied with confusion, "What are you talking about, Colette? Rosti is a guy just like me, definitely. In fact, his is even bigger than mine." Colette's face turned crimson at the thought of the two guys bathing together and the size of Rosti's. Will continued, saying that although they might have touched each other a bit more than usual, that's just how they have been from the start. Just then, Rosti appeared with drinks and sat between them. Will asked where Rosti's drink was, and Rosti said he didn't need one because he would share Will's. Colette immediately offered her drink and told Will to share it with her. Will, bewildered, didn't know which drink to choose. Rosti then suggested that Will should go prepare his sword. Will felt uneasy, but in the end, Colette also didn't want to join them, saying that having a mage accompany Will to the blacksmith would upset the dwarves. So Will left, leaving the two of them behind. Colette exhaled deeply and decided to ask directly whether Rosti and Will had something beyond friendship. Rosti immediately punched a nearby wall and declared boldly, "It's not just your imagination, Colette. I love Will more than anyone else." Seeing this, Colette couldn't believe her ears and asked again, "What?" Rosti continued to declare, "I love Will more than you do, Colette." This statement made Colette furious, and tears streamed down her face as she shouted, "Let me tell you, Will and I have been inseparable for 4 years. Rosti knew this but was undeterred, saying, "I know, but Colette, have you ever shared a bath with Will? Probably not, right?" The naive girl and Rosti have now officially declared a rivalry over Will. Will walked alone, feeling uneasy as he noticed the tension between the two. Suddenly, someone called his name. Startled, he turned to see Rihanna, one of the top students of the academy. Will immediately felt the disparity between their worlds, one a top-tier genius and the other just a mere incompetent. Will politely asked, "Is there something you need from me?" Rihanna requested that Will accompany her for a moment. Without saying a word, Will felt anxious and followed her. They entered a luxurious mansion where Rihanna gently closed the door behind them. Will was immediately surprised to find Theon glaring at him with an intense look, as well as Julius, Ignore, and Rihanna, all top students. Rihanna then explained that the comprehensive practical combat exam would actually begin in the final year of the next academic term. Therefore, she wanted to form a team of 5 here to tackle the dungeon. Will was stunned by this revelation. As the practical combat course results were announced at the academy, the final level of the tower was about to be opened. The points received had skyrocketed, accompanied by tremendous dangers. With only a short time left until the graduation exams, it was not an exaggeration to say that whether one could ascend the tower or not would depend on the results of this practical combat course. Theon immediately slammed the table and shouted, "What the hell are you doing here, you useless one?" Julius then asked, "Rihanna, what's going on? Are you telling me to freeze him, or something?" Will was terrified. It was clear that these two did not like him at all. He turned to Rihanna with a pleading look, shaking his head repeatedly. Rihanna coolly asked, "Is that not allowed?" Her nonchalant attitude caused Will's blood pressure to drop. He was surprised to discover that Rihanna was so indifferent. Theon was ignored once more and shouted, "Hey, are you ignoring me again?" Ignore suddenly narrowed his eyes, raised his wand, and instantly transformed their surroundings into a field of flowers. Everything came to a halt, and Theon ceased his actions. Ignore then sarcastically asked Theon, "Since when did a mage dare to act on par with a lowly dwarf?" Theon let go of Will, and Will realized that this was a special illusion magic of the elf race. Ignore smiled and said they should first hear Liana's story. Liana explained, "As I mentioned earlier, the comprehensive practical combat exam is about to begin. For the most outstanding mages of our year, I want to include him, someone who has shown exceptional ability at the magic tournament." Will blushed suddenly, while Liana continued, "He possesses a power that we don't have, and I believe it will be useful in the dungeon." Julius immediately objected, saying, "I'm questioning your perspective on life, Liana. Even the search magic used in the dungeon is something he can't utilize, so this guy will just be a hindrance. Are you being fooled by a rare theatrical performance?" Theon also chimed in, "I'm also declining to team up with him." Will was on the verge of tears, while Ignore crossed his legs and sarcastically declared, "The mix of pride and boredom in your comments still sounds like the distant barking of defeated dogs, doesn't it? Can you still look down on someone who has defeated you? I'm skeptical about your character." Theon was incredulous that Ignore would say such things, but Ignore didn't stop. He continued, "With extraordinary power equivalent to that of the dwarf race, coupled with sensitivity comparable to that of a monster, and seasoned combat experience with no flaws, your staffs have already lost to his sword." The two of them scowled. Julius mocked, "Aren't you just getting points by sucking up to Liana, Mr. Elf?" Ignore was unfazed by this, even respecting Liana more because of it. "If someone like her has assessed him this way, then I will also value promoting the incompetent. Unlike you two, who were furious, Will was sweating profusely." Liana said directly, "I will use Ignore just like I use all of you. I want to climb the tower and be the top student of the year. What I seek is evaluation, value, and future, not just what I have now." Will asked, "What about after the tournament?" She replied that she had received an invitation from the Thunder Saints faction. Will was astonished. Even with such a stable future, Liana was still pushing herself further? Liana closed her eyes and said, "Because currently, those remaining in the academy are leftovers. Or rather, the incompetent." The two guys fell silent, feeling as though she was referring to them, while Will was surprised that this girl viewed all the remaining students as incompetent. Liana added that she carried the burden of bringing glory to the Owenzau's family, a short-lived family. Climbing the Witch Tower alone would not be enough. She was even aiming for the position of Magia Windy. Everyone remained silent. Liana knew that everyone here shared that grand ambition. She then placed a coin into a cup and said, "If you find what I said valuable, put your coin into this cup." Ignore immediately agreed, knowing that no other team had higher combat power than the one sitting here. Julius felt this was like being coerced into gaining more credit. Theon contemplated, while Will held the coin, swallowed nervously, unsure of what to decide. Will returned to his two friends, who had been waiting for him for so long that they went searching for him. But they hadn't found him at the forge either. By then, what decision had Will made? He decided to join Liana's group. With all 5 coins collected, Liana smiled. In class, Professor Werkner was lecturing about the practical combat exam, which would start in 10 days. Levels 7 through 10 would be opened, allowing students to fight stronger monsters to earn more credit points. The total credit points for this practical exam could exceed 1,000 points. Defeating the boss of a level would yield even more credit points. This was an opportunity to make up for any credit shortfall and take a step closer to the tower. Will and his friends were extremely excited after hearing this, but Professor Edward threw cold water on their enthusiasm by saying, "Of course, there will be deaths. Last year, 4 students were killed by monsters. Although teachers are assigned to support in the dungeon, it cannot completely prevent this situation." The excitement in the air was dampened as Professor Edward continued with a stern tone. "Don't be reckless. Put aside any notion of mere bravery without strategy. What you should be pursuing is not admiration for the title of Magia Windy, but a steely resolve to understand your current position." Meanwhile, in the tower, an old man with a blindfold, looking quite impressive, was reporting to Magia Windy Carriot. Carriot said, "There's no need to report every little detail, Logwell. Even if you're temporarily in charge, you're not my representative." Logwell replied, "Lightning is reckless, ice is lazy, and the Holy One is arrogant. The most suitable candidate is Instia Balam." Upon hearing this, Carriot laughed and asked if the Radiant King hadn't returned yet. Logwell reported that he was still on a distant expedition and hadn't come back, leaving Carriot perplexed since the barrier was on the verge of collapsing and he had yet to appear. This was near the Regarden base on the 7th floor. On the first day of the practical combat exam, everyone was amazed by the size of the base. Liana immediately called Colette over and asked, "Did I invite you to come along?" Colette blushed and stammered, "If Will is going, then I'm going too." Rosti also said his goodbyes to Will, explaining that as a member of the technical department, he couldn't join them. Professor Edward announced that it was time. The students lined up neatly and listened to him say, "The practical combat exam, also known as high-intensity exploration, is different from regular practical combat. You will need to survive in the dungeon for a week. Confirm the bases established on each floor scattered on the map. If you finish the exam or decide to quit, you must evacuate to these bases. Our teachers will be waiting for you there." Werkner looked at Will, having a lot of trust in him. Will thought that he must achieve results here and then head to Elfie's location. The signal was given, and all the students began to rush into the 7th floor. The group jumped down into a massive cave mouth and fell freely. Will and Colette were terrified, their faces pale. Thanks to Ignore's magic, the others landed smoothly, but Will and Colette landed on their backsides. As soon as they touched the ground, monsters attacked them. It appeared to be a centipede, but Will was astonished to see it was actually a massive swarm of crimson ants. Will prepared to draw his sword to clear the way, knowing that if the mages were surrounded on all sides, they would be helpless. However, Ignore said, "There's no need, Will. Don't you know why the Owinzaw's family is called that?" Will was stunned to see Liana charging forward, surrounded by a multitude of chaotic lightning bolts. Her family was known for its knightly lineage. Liana began chanting a spell, summoning the power of thunder. A powerful lightning bolt infused into her body, increasing her speed. Liana plunged into the swarm of giant ants, and the lightning obeyed her commands, striking the ants from all directions and tearing them apart. In an instant, she had eliminated dozens of the ants. Will realized it was an enhancement spell. Ignore confirmed this, adding that she was a rare specialist in close-range magic among contemporary mages. Liana casually turned back and told everyone to move forward quickly, so they wouldn't have to compete with other teams for credit points. Will swallowed nervously, having never seen such dominance in close-range combat before. Meanwhile, in a part of the cave near a deep chasm, fresh blood was dripping. An enigmatic figure in a hooded cloak was muttering angrily, "Damn it! What do you mean? Retrieve that thing in secret. Aren't we ruining the students' festival?" Meanwhile, another figure was strangling a man, who immediately decapitated. This figure appeared grotesque, exuding dark energy, and his head seemed to be an ominous mist rather than a human one. Holding the severed head, he said, "At this point, there's no choice but to kill them all." That time, Werkner asked Will if he knew which type of magic was most important in a dungeon. Was it offensive magic? Defensive magic? Neither. It was search magic, a common